The city was a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. Streetlights flickered, casting an eerie glow on the deserted sidewalks. A lone cat darted between overflowing trash cans, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. The air hung heavy, thick with the smell of rain and distant exhaust fumes. It was the kind of night that felt alive, pulsing with unseen dangers and unspoken secrets. The silence was broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing car or the distant wail of a siren. In the distance, the faint glow of downtown promised life. But here, in the forgotten corners of the city, shadows reigned supreme. It was a place where the past could easily hide, and where the future seemed uncertain at best. Jack walked with his head down, his shoulders hunched against the chill wind. He was a ghost, a shadow moving through the darkness. No one paid him any mind, and that was exactly how he liked it. By day, he was just another face in the crowd, a cog in the city's machinery. But by night, he became a creature of habit, his movements precise, his senses heightened. He had learned to blend in, to disappear into the background noise of city life. His apartment was his sanctuary, a small, sparsely furnished space where he could shut out the world and pretend that the past didn't exist. He'd built a life for himself, a simple life, but it was his, or so he thought. It started with a letter, a plain white envelope, addressed in a hand he thought he'd forgotten. It lay on his doorstep like a coiled snake, its presence both alluring and terrifying. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He knew he shouldn't open it. He knew that whatever secrets it held could shatter the fragile peace he had built for himself. But some part of him, some dark and buried part, yearned for the truth. With trembling hands, he tore open the envelope and began to read. The words on the page swam before Jack's eyes, each one a hammer blow to his carefully constructed present. They spoke of a time he had tried desperately to forget, a time when the line between right and wrong had been blurred beyond recognition. Back then, the thrill of the chase, the allure of easy money had been a siren song he couldn't resist. He had been young, foolish, eager to prove himself. He had fallen in with a bad crowd, the kind of people who lived on the edge, who thrived on chaos and danger. He had thought they were his friends, his brothers in arms. He had been wrong. They had been snakes, all of them ready to strike at the first sign of weakness. The name at the bottom of the letter was like a brand, seared into his memory. Max. Even after all these years, just the sight of that name was enough to send a shiver down his spine. Max had been the mastermind, the charismatic leader who had drawn Jack into his web of deceit. He was older, more experienced, a predator who could sniff out vulnerability with uncanny accuracy. Jack had been drawn to Max's confidence, his aura of invincibility. He had craved the acceptance, the sense of belonging that Max offered. He had been willing to do anything to prove his loyalty, to earn his place at Max's side. He had robbed, cheated, and lied without a second thought. He had become the very thing he had always despised. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. Maybe it was the look on the face of one of their victims, the raw terror in their eyes. Maybe it was the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach that told him he was in over his head. Whatever it was, Jack had finally realized the error of his ways. He had seen the darkness that lurked beneath Max's charm, the cold, calculating heart of a true criminal. And so he had made a choice to walk away from it all, to leave the life of crime behind and start anew. It hadn't been easy. There had been threats, warnings, attempts on his life, but he had persevered, driven by the hope of redemption, the dream of a better future. He had changed his name, moved to a new city, built a wall of secrecy around himself. He had told himself that the past was dead and buried, that he could outrun his demons. But the letter proved him wrong. The past was not dead, it was very much alive, and it had come calling for its due. As he stared at the crumpled paper in his hand, Jack felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the core that his past had finally caught up with him, and this time there would be no escape. The city, once a place of anonymity, now felt like a hunting ground. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every corner a potential ambush. The rumble of traffic sounded like approaching footsteps, the laughter of strangers like whispered threats. His senses, once dulled by routine, were now on high alert, every nerve ending thrumming with a low-grade terror. Sleep offered no escape, only a descent into a restless twilight filled with fragmented memories and nameless fears. He tossed and turned, the letter a lead weight on his chest. The words, stark and unforgiving, echoed in the silence of his small apartment. Debts unpaid, promises broken. The past had a long memory. His days were no better. The faces of his co-workers, once so familiar, now seemed to hold a knowing smirk. The murmur of conversations in the hallway felt like veiled threats. Even the most mundane tasks, filing reports, answering phones, became fraught with suspicion. Was he imagining it, or were people watching him, their gaze lingering a beat too long? He started taking different routes home, avoiding dark alleys and deserted streets. He double-checked locks, peered through windows, jumped at every creak and groan of his aging apartment building. He knew it was irrational, this descent into paranoia, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, hunted. The inevitable confrontation came on a night like any other, the air thick with humidity, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. Jack was walking home, his mind a jumble of anxieties, when he saw him. The figure was leaning against a lamppost, a silhouette wreathed in cigarette smoke, his face obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. Even from a distance, Jack knew who it was. Max. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath, stopping his heart. Time seemed to warp and twist, the years melting away as if they had never been. He was no longer a free man, but a prisoner of his past, caught in the web of his own making. Max took a long drag from his cigarette, the glowing ember illuminating his face for a fleeting moment. The years had etched lines around his eyes, hardened the set of his jaw, but the predatory gleam in his eyes remained unchanged. He flicked the cigarette to the ground, the ember winking out like a dying star. "Well, well, well," he said, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down Jack's spine. "Look who it is, our prodigal son returns." Jack's heart hammered against his ribs, his mouth dry, his mind racing. He wanted to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of the city. But he knew it was futile. Max had found him once. He would find him again. There was no escape, not anymore. "We have unfinished business, Jack," Max said, his voice a low growl that echoed in the stillness of the night. "You can't hide forever." Jack knew arguing was pointless. Max had always been a man of action, driven by a ruthless ambition that brooked no opposition. His only option was to run, to put as much distance between himself and his past as possible. He turned and fled, his feet pounding on the pavement, his lungs burning with exertion. The darkness swallowed him whole. The familiar streets transformed into a labyrinth of shadows and echoes. Behind him he heard Max's laughter, cold and sharp as shattered glass. It spurred him on, fueled his desperation. Every instinct screamed at him to keep running, to outrun the shadows that clung to him like a shroud. He ducked down a narrow alleyway, the stench of rotting garbage stinging his nostrils. The walls closed in on him, brick and concrete pressing against him, threatening to crush him. He could hear Max gaining on him, his heavy footsteps echoing off the walls, a relentless drumbeat that mirrored the frantic pounding of his own heart. He emerged onto a deserted street, the faint glow of downtown, a distant beacon in the darkness. Ahead, he saw the silhouette of an abandoned warehouse, its windows dark and empty, its doors hanging open like the gaping maw of some monstrous beast. He didn't hesitate. He had to lose Max, to shake him off his trail. The warehouse, with its promise of darkness and concealment, was his only chance. He slipped inside, the door groaning shut behind him. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay, the only sound the skittering of rats in the darkness. He stumbled through a labyrinth of rusted machinery and discarded crates, his heart pounding against his ribs. He could hear Max moving around outside, his footsteps slow and deliberate, like a hunter stalking his prey. He found himself in a large, open space, the ceiling lost in the shadows high above. The only light came from a few small, grimy windows, casting a pale, ethereal glow on the dusty floor. He was trapped, with nowhere left to run. He turned, slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he always carried, a slim blade that offered him little comfort in the face of Max's raw, brutal strength. "You can't hide forever, Jack," Max's voice echoed through the vast emptiness of the warehouse. He stepped into the pool of light, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with an almost feral intensity. "It's time to face the consequences of your actions." Jack knew it was pointless to plead for mercy, to try to explain. Max had already judged him, had already passed sentence. The only thing left was the execution. Jack drew a deep breath, the metallic tang of fear thick in his throat. He knew he couldn't outrun Max, couldn't outfight him. His only hope lay in outsmarting him, in exploiting the one weakness Max had never been able to overcome, his own volatile temper. Jack lunged, not at Max, but towards a precariously balanced metal shelf. It toppled with a deafening clang, crashing down between them, a wall of rusted metal and shattered wood. Max roared in frustration, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Jack didn't waste the precious seconds his desperate gambit had bought him. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins, and ran blindly, desperately towards the back of the warehouse. He could hear Max behind him, cursing, the sound of his pursuit a terrifying counterpoint to the frantic beat of his own heart. The air was thick with dust, the taste of it gritty in his mouth. He choked back a sob, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for respite. But he couldn't stop, he wouldn't stop. Not while there was still a chance, however slim, of outrunning his past. He burst through a set of double doors, momentarily blinded by the sudden wash of moonlight. He was in a loading dock, the ground sloping down towards an alleyway that snaked away into the darkness. He could hear Max behind him, closer now, his heavy tread shaking the rickety metal structure of the loading dock. Jack didn't hesitate. He took a running leap, hurtling himself off the edge of the dock, the ground rushing up to meet him. He landed hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, pain lancing through his ankle. He didn't stop to assess the damage. There was no time. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his ankle, and limped towards the promise of anonymity offered by the maze of alleyways. He didn't know how long he ran. Time lost all meaning, measured only in the rasp of his breath, the pounding of his heart. The city, once his prison, now offered him sanctuary, its shadows concealing him, its silence a balm to his raw nerves. He didn't stop until he reached the river, its black water a swirling mirror to the turmoil within him. He glanced back just once and saw Max emerge from the shadows of the warehouse. He watched, his breath catching in his throat, as Max stepped onto the loading dock. He saw the look of triumph on Max's face, heard his roar of victory just before the rotten floorboards gave way. He saw Max disappear from view, heard the sickening thud as he hit the ground below, a thud that echoed the finality of death.